The purpose of this video is to give you a brief introduction to the character of Alexander the Great, one of the most famous generals, if not the most famous general from the Greek world. So we're going to do two things in this video. We're going to talk a little bit about what I like to call his Homeric journey, discuss Alexander's birth, his character, but also his motivations, which will lead into, in the next video, a discussion of the Battle of Issus, and his campaigns against Darius in Persia. Here is that picture of the Kingdom of Macedon that I showed in the last video on Philip, where you can see that by the time of Philip II's death in 336, Macedonia had become quite the power in the region, encompassing basically all of modern Greece, either through direct control or through allies. And you can see the League of Corinth in yellow. Remember, the League of Corinth created by Philip as a way to control Greece as he turned his attention east to Persia. So Macedonia, very large. Thrace, which was allied with Macedonia, is how Macedonian troops will get to Persia. As you can see on the right, through Byzantium, now Constantinople. But they're going to cross a little bit south of that. In that little yellow area just north of the island of Lesbos is where they're going to cross. So, very large empire, Persia at this time, still probably the largest empire in this part of the world, and it's going to be an interesting war for some reason with the size of Persia compared to Macedonia, and the way that Alexander is going to wage his battle against the Persians. So, we're talking about Alexander III of Macedonia, born in 356, died in 323. You can see a bust of him there on the right with his sort of canonical hairstyle. Alexander always looks the same in every bust. Young, with that hair, with the part in the middle, sort of looking towards the sky, which implies the divinity. Alexander was born in 356, the same day that the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus burned down, one of the great wonders, 7 wonders of the ancient world. Supposedly, the reason that Artemis let her temple burn was because she was too busy being present at the birth of Alexander the Great. One of the things you'll notice with Alexander, if you've read about him, if you've heard about him, and one of the things we'll see in this class, is that Alexander is as much of a myth as he is a man. There is so much fiction about him, even in the ancient world, that it's difficult sometimes to separate Alexander the man from Alexander the myth and the legend. From the beginning, Alexander was raised to be Philip's successor. He had become regent of the kingdom at the age of 16 when his father was out on campaign. And Philip seemed to recognize something in Alexander from birth because he attempted to give him the best education he could. He was tutored by Aristotle, the famous Greek philosopher, who came up to Macedonia and tutored Alexander for several years. Alexander received as the best military education he could get. From a young age, he's on campaign. He's learning from Philip's generals. And when he did his schooling and his military apprenticeship, he did it with many of the men who would later become his most important advisors and generals, people like Parmenio, a name that you'll see throughout readings on Alexander and even in this class. Alexander becomes king in 336 when his father is assassinated. Whether or not his mother Olympias was involved in that, whether he was involved in that, whether it was a disgruntled bodyguard, the accounts differ. Again, there's so much different information about Alexander because of the mythology of Alexander the Great. He was not universally accepted as king. His mother Olympias was not Macedonian, so Philip had several wives. Remember again that the Macedonians are this considered to be this hypersexual, hypermasculine society that believed in polygamy. So when Olympias, who's not Macedonian, has Alexander, there was some resentment and some hesitation to accept him as king. He did receive the best education. He was raised as Philip's successor. But his character, I think, is one of the most fascinating things about him. According to John Wary, who wrote a wonderful book on ancient warfare, Alexander's character was, quote, full of contradictions. Some of the words that get associated with Alexander: young, bold, brash, daring, beautiful, excessive, reckless, manic depressive, violent. All of these words can be associated with Alexander. the Macedonian kings really ruled through a cult of personality. So having a very strong personality was important. Philip had it, his father had it, Alexander had it. But of those words I just mentioned, I think violent and manic depressive are the keys. Alexander is known for these violent mood swings, these over-the-top plans, bouts of depression, violence. When Greece revolted against Macedonia after Philip's death, Alexander marched down to Thebes and completely destroyed it, burned it to the ground, bulldozed it. They didn't have bulldozers. Bulldozes the site and completely destroys the city of Thebes simply as a warning to others. He killed his best friend Cletus, when he was drunk. He ordered the execution of his friend Philotas, and Philotas' father Parmenio being his number one general because there were rumors of a coup. And he becomes incredibly reckless with his own person. During the siege of the city belonging to the Malians, Alexander actually climbs up a ladder to the top of the wall of the city by himself, jumps down into the city by himself, and is surrounded and fighting off this huge group of Malians. He's actually shot with arrows several times until his soldiers can get up over the wall and pull him back out. He had an incredibly deep love of Homer, and this is what you read in the Lendon article. And this affected the organization of the army, his conduct and how he perceived combat and valor. And again, with Lendon, the Homeric hero code meshed well with Macedonian culture and custom. You remember how Macedonians are perceived and how the Homeric wars happened. We'll see a little bit more of that in detail in a moment. The Macedonian army that Alexander inherits from Philip is basically Philip's. He does do some things tactically, but the formation, the logistics, and the organization when he invades Persia, that's basically Philip's army. And he personally leads and improves on the companion cavalry. They become the shock troops of his army. And he develops with this Macedonian army what you could call a hammer and anvil strategy, where the phalanx becomes the anvil, holds fast, and the companions become the hammer. And we'll see some diagrams of battles in a moment in the next PowerPoint, where you can see exactly how some of the tactics that he learned at the Battle of Chaeronea and some of the things he may have learned from his father via Epaminondas make the companions the elite troops in this hammer and anvil strategy that he will employ over and over and over again. Now, Alexander does have a few technical aspects for his invasion of Persia that he improves on. For example, the innovative use of siege engines. Large walled cities are hard to take in the ancient world without artillery and siege engines, and Alexander is going to use those to great effect. He started relying heavily on advanced scouting, where he would actually try to learn the terrain, where he would try to figure out the best way to do things through advanced strategy. And he paid great attention to morale. Alexander, one of those generals that seems to have really thought about being perceived as one of the boys. The revolt in India, for example, after he had pushed his soldiers too far, and they revolt when they reach India, and we want to go home. And so Alexander turned them around and said, okay, let's go home. Well, let's go back to Persia. Though he did punish his soldiers by making them march through a desert on the way back, which ended up wiping out a good number of his troops. But he did pay attention to morale, and his soldiers fought for him, not for Macedonia. They fought for Alexander. Now, what drove Alexander for his invasion of Persia? Well, if you remember from the last video on Philip, the freedom of the Greeks was one of Philip's rallying cries, partially for the creation of the League of Corinth, but that seemed to be the rallying cry for an invasion of Persia. And Alexander promoted that heavily, that he was invading Persia, he was going after Persia for the freedom of the Greeks, both of Ionia, and to keep the Greek mainland safe. That Persia was still a danger, and Alexander was going to once and for all end the threat of Persia and allow the Greeks to be free. as you see on the screen, that was completely an excuse. Alexander went on this campaign for glory, for personal gain, and because this is what you do as a Macedonian king. Without conquering, without expansion, without showing your Homeric values and glory in the battlefield, you're not much of a king. What drove Alexander? In large part, Homer. And this is important. And Lendon, on page 117 of his article, says this: the heroes of epic were always present to the Greeks as companions in the mind and models of conduct. But the Greek love of Homer seems to have been unusually passionate in the royal Macedonian house, and strongest of all in Philip's son, that's Alexander. Alexander, from the get-go, seemed to be wanting to improve on the great Homeric heroes. He supposedly slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow. He made sure when he invaded Persia that he brought with him authors, poets, and all sorts of literary men in order to write his history, to write his Iliad. When he invades Persia, he immediately goes to Troy, where he supposedly finds Achilles' sword, takes it with him. He sleeps outside of Achilles' tomb on the beach at Troy, worships there, sacrifices to Achilles, and Alexander seemed to really want to become the next Achilles, or even better than Achilles. And this Homeric style of warfare, and if you remember all the way back to our discussion of Homer, the arete, the kleos, the kudos, all of this really comes to the front in Alexander. And I think that's a good context for looking at how Alexander conquers Persia. If you keep always in your mind when reading about Alexander and looking at his campaigns, that the Homeric ideal, the Iliadic ideal, is always first and foremost in Alexander's mind. Even if it's subconsciously, it's always at the forefront of Alexander's mind. Now, what does he invade? Well, here's Persia at its greatest extent. It looks not unlike a praying mantis aiming itself at Greece, and you can see just how small Greece is. This is in 490 at the time of the Battle of Marathon. But in 336, when Alexander invades Persia, the Persian Empire is still nearly this large and still extraordinarily powerful and extraordinarily wealthy. And Alexander is going to conquer all of this. And if you see on the right, you see India, the Hindu Kush, and the Indus River. Alexander will go that far with his troops. And remember, Alexander's troops walk everywhere. There's no transports. There's horses, but this army can only go as fast as it can walk. And it's going to walk from Greece, from Macedonia, all the way to India, and then back. And you can see on this map the campaigns of Alexander, where you can see that he didn't just march straight to the capital. He started with Macedonia, down to Miletus, up to Gordium, down to the modern-day Palestine, Damascus, Jerusalem, over into Egypt to go seek an oracle to see if he was the son of Zeus, back through to Babylon and Susa and Persepolis, the three great capitals of the Persian Empire, up into Afghanistan and into the mountains, the Hindu Kush Mountains, and then across, and you can see on the far right in 326, even fighting in India against King Porus. And then back through the desert, you can see the numbers 325 at the bottom of the screen on the right, and then back to Persepolis and to Alexander's eventual death in 323. It's insane that Alexander did all of this in the time that he had. It is mind-blowing. And that's one of the reasons Alexander is given the name the Great. Taking an army, keeping it together this long, and marching it this far, maintaining its peak fighting ability, it's insane. It is mind-blowing. It is incredible. And this, in large part, is why Alexander is considered the Great. His empire does not outlive him, and that's what we're going to be talking about in the next video, whether or not Alexander's greatness extended beyond the battlefield. And you can see here just one more example of this Homeric drive at the Battle of the Granicus, which we'll talk about in the next video. Wearing a heroic panoply, Alexander fought in rivalry with his ancestors Achilles. seeking out the heroes to slay in single combat as Achilles had once cut down Hector. And in the next video, we'll see how this worked at the Battle of the Granicus and other battles in Persia.